You brought up two things. One was about giving the example of sea rescue when you turn over the information that the pilot may be going down and he may need some help from the Navy. That was one. And then you brought up the B-29 was part of that flight group that went to Hiroshima with the Enola Gay, and so this B-29 was on there. I got two comments. One was with the sea rescue. I had often heard the story and read the book about the Iwo Jima raid, where President George Herbert Walker Bush, as a Navy pilot, had gone down and had radioed in order to get picked up or to let people know that he was in distress. Iwo Jima was very close to Iwo Jima in comparison to other places. So obviously his call had to go to Iwo Jima, I would guess.
You see, George Bush was there about a year before I was.
Oh, okay.
So Iwo Jima had not entered the picture at the time that he was shot down in the bay at Iwo Jima. However, that brings to mind the fact that our 7th Fighter Command fighters, not every time they went airborne was it on a flight mission to go to combat, because when their plane had to be repaired and fueled up and so forth, the pilot often had to go take it up to see if it was flight worthy. So Iwo Jima was close enough to Iwo Jima, and I don't remember what the distance was, but it was close enough that it was the primary target for fighter planes which had to go up and do something. And Iwo Jima was an air base for Japanese, and of course by the time I got there there were no Japanese planes to mount anything on Iwo Jima. But one time the anti-aircraft had shot down one of our planes, and the pilot was in a raft in the bay of Iwo Jima, and our other pilots then were flying protection for him because they kept anti-aircraft things under constant strafing fire, and it was a very interesting thing. So that episode, which I read about President Bush when he was a pilot, was kind of like repeated by the pilots that had gotten shot down while I was there, and that impressed me. And the pilot that was shot down there did not survive. The efforts that, as I recall, the efforts did not survive because the Japanese, he was in machine gun range of the shore and in his raft. But these pilots who were shot down, and often it happened. I'd like to tell you another episode of a plane, of a typical call that we got and recorded, and what the event was. On a return from a bombing mission, a B-29 on one occasion had called in when I was on duty. I was not the one speaking to him, but I could hear him, because you can hear from your tent sometimes in the bivouac area. You could hear the radio frequencies that communicated with the tower. So by the time they communicated with the tower, the pilots did, sometimes you could tell what was going on by what you overheard, not from the headset that you wore when you were on duty. This particular pilot called in and asked permission to land and said, I have wounded men aboard and I'm out of gas and one of my props is feathered. And so he was, of course, turned over to the tower and was approaching the landing strip. That Iwo Jima, by the way, had 3 landing strips that B-29s could land on, as I recall. I know that they had only 3 landing strips, 3 control towers, and this pilot said, I'm going to fly over Iwo Jima. I have some wounded men aboard. Sergeant so-and-so is going to jump out of the plane with a certain crew member who is wounded and can't operate his parachute. So on my first pass over the airstrip, I will pass and Sergeant will jump in his parachute on the airstrip, which he did, holding that man in his arms.
Oh, goodness.
They both survived.
Wow.
Then that same plane made the circle after dropping them. We are going to have to ditch the plane, so the rest of us will jump out on our second pass. So he came back around, made his circle and flew back around, and he and all his crew members jumped out of the airplane. He set the airplane, the pilot did, on automatic control, and it went out over the ocean, and some U.S. fighter planes were dispatched to shoot it down. Let me tell you why. Because more than one plane had flown over like that and had to be ditched because its landing gear would not go down or some other feature which was necessary. So this other plane in an earlier episode had been set on automatic pilot and the crew jumped out and the plane flew in a circle because that's what planes do if they're set on automatic pilot and then they have a crew to correct it. Typically they do that. And so that particular plane that flew in a circle flew right over our bivouac area, and that occurred when I was not on the island, but the plane passed close enough to the top of our bivouac area where our tents were, so they said to me, the tents felt the puff of the air as the plane flew over us and dived into the water right there off the beach.
Jeez.
That was an interesting story that I heard, and it didn't occur while I was there, but that's why the plane that I did hear was shot down from then on by our own fighter planes. So it would not come back around and damage Iwo Jima.
Sound like they learned it well. But then back to, we're talking about B-29s, that, the B-29 that was in the flight group with the Enola Gay that ended up landing on Iwo Jima, that was kind of an interesting story. I've done some research since then. I think the kind of like the nickname of the plane was the Big Stink. And I've been able to find logbooks and records and stories on the internet now that some 75 years has passed, that describe and also show what was going on with that and kind of filled out the story. But you had your own perspective of it that I thought was an interesting story. So
Okay.
let me turn you loose on that.
Yes, you may. Thanks. I happened to be the fighter clerk on duty when the big stink. I didn't know it was going to be called that, but when it's called that, it's called in. I was the one who took the call, and he wanted to ask permission to land on Iwo Jima. So I repeated his call letters, whatever they were, and then told him that I was turning him over to the control officer, which I did. That was the end of my communication with him. However, I had learned this was such a significant day that was the only plane in the air other than our own combat air patrol, which, by the way, combat air patrol stayed airborne at all times in the event any emergency developed which they could service. So this was the only plane in the air that was flying that day, as far as I knew, other than our combat air patrol. So I didn't do a thing, but when I got my 5-minute break, there's 10 minutes break of each hour for the person performing the duty I was performing. So as soon as I had the opportunity, I went to a phone and made contact with one of my buddies who live in a tent with me and told him, for God's sakes, get a Jeep and go to the other end of the island and see what that plane's doing. So they did. And they returned at the end of the day to me, and this is the story they told me. When that plane landed, Tom, it was totally surrounded by SPs, MPs, and they were elbow to elbow. Now, a B-29 has a 200-foot wingspan. It also is 200 feet long, approximately. So that was a huge circle. And they told me that no member of the crew on that plane exited that circle. Food was brought to the circle and handed over the MPs and SPs' shoulders on trays to the crew so they could eat. So they took the tray back to the plane and ate, and then after they had been there a while to eat, the plane got airborne again and departed. That was an interesting story that I heard when I got back to my tent that at the end of my shift.
What were some of the rumors of what was going on with this B-29? What did y'all know and not know about what the B-29 showing up at Iwo Jima?
Okay, and what we speculated?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that requires me describing the overall situation of the day. 2 days before that, I'd like to be accurate with this, but the details don't really matter. About 2 days before that, one day there were no bombers that went over, because typically at that time, in August, about 200 B-29s flew over Iwo Jima or near Iwo Jima every day from Guam and Saipan to bomb different parts of Japan. So, two days before that plane flew there, there were no B-29s that flew over Iwo Jima. We thought maybe some peace negotiations were going on at the time. We speculated that maybe Roosevelt was coming to the island and they were gonna, or by that time it was getting to be Harry Truman, So, what really was taking place is instead of the 200 planes going each day to bomb Japan, none went that day so that they could refurbish all of them and send 400 planes over Japan in one day. They did. And when those planes went over, that took much longer than 200, and we were speculating again. The following day, there was not a plane in the air, not a B-29, except that one, the Big Stink. So we speculated that on that Big Stink would be some high important individual on his way to Japan, maybe to do some peace talks or something. That's the kind of conversation that we were having at the time. And that was a very exciting time.
How did you guys come to know what had happened that day? How did y'all learn of the A bomb? You were there on Iwo Jima.
When the A bomb was dropped, you see, we had a radio station on Iwo Jima, which just broadcast news, music, and so forth, and so we heard the news on a regular basis. And it was not only available on the little radio if we had one in our tent where we lived, it was broadcast over loudspeakers to all bivouac areas. So that news was, including listening to Tokyo Rose, was broadcast over that loudspeaker system to everybody on the island. So when the atomic bomb was dropped, I'm not sure of the way and the news was delivered to us and at what time we became knowledgeable about it. I cannot recall that. But before the second one was dropped a week later, the news was out. And so it became general knowledge to us before Nagasaki was wiped out by the second atomic bomb. There had been communication going on, we later learned, with the Japanese after that first one was dropped. Between that time and when the second one was dropped. And there seemed to be the rationale for dropping the second one was to convince them that what the spokespersons for the USA were saying to the Japanese authorities and leaders was that they could be wiped off the map, so to speak, if their enemy had more bombs like that. Actually, the bombing raids with incendiary bombs were almost as damaging each day as the atomic bomb was when it was dropped. That's just how fierce the war had become. You don't forget these things, but you certainly do forget some details. You certainly do forget some details. And in '97, I suppose I retained a surprising amount.
Many people have commented on that. And I tell you what, we're gonna stop it here. And when we get back together, what we'll do is talk about the victory in the Pacific and what it took to get home, what it took to get discharged, what it took to get back to Problem Solve, what it took to get back to LSU. How's that sound?
That sounded good. It's a pleasure to be with you. I certainly hope the people who see this enjoy it.
Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.